We were going through the topics in the course, all of them dealing with the nature of creativity. And this is Tyler coming in. Yes. Please be on time. In art, science, and technology, though as a matter of fact, as you'll see, one of the topics is why is creativity to be thought to be limited to them? Why not to all of life? Maybe, as in the religious traditions, to the nature of the universe. In the most popular gospel, the Bible, the world begins with God creating everything. What was the nature of that creativity? How does that creativity relate to us as human beings? Are we capable of having a creativity that is as authentic as that stupendous divine act that began everything as we know it? That's one of the problems that is related to the nature of creativity. We'll be coming back to that time and again, and in fact, with the new material today, I'll even start with that very briefly. In the last classes, we talked about creativity in relation to our concepts of what an artist is, but not just any artist, let's say particular artists like Beethoven, who was aloof and lived in a way that most people were incapable of in his personal life and also in his artistic life, or an artist like Mozart, who was said to have been taking dictation from God, at least in the play and film Amadeus. Salieri, his competitor, says that after he's read a manuscript of Mozart that has no corrections, that seem to have come straight from his hand, and Salieri can't imagine that there weren't any mistakes or alterations or drafts that he went through, as if he were taking dictation from God. So the creativity then would have gone through God into a unique person like Mozart. Then there is the concept that is present in a book by the 20th century author Arthur Koestler, Koestler, called The Act of Creation, in which Koestler analyzes and defines creativity in terms of what he calls bisociation, which is the welding together of two different and conflicting matrices of thought, each of which we're used to in ordinary life, but they're merging together we're not used to. And that's, for him, the fundamental idea. We'll come back to that and discuss that even today. Then there is the ideas of creativity being related to the unconscious or to the nature of dreams. In my book, Feeling and Imagination, which you're reading, deal with it in terms of imagination. That was what we were discussing in class last time. Today, it's in relation to idealization, and that's what Nick is going to be talking about. And then after that, creativity is an ultimate source of what I call consummation. The general link between these three chapters is that through imagination we make something new in the world, and therefore it is creative. Through idealization, we use those acts of imagination to pursue ideals, and the making of and pursuit of ideals, which is characteristic of human beings more than any other creature, is itself an act of creativity. And that's one way of analyzing human behavior. Why is it that people go to war as much as they do? Well, because they have a cause, whether the cause is religious or political or racial, related to one's ethnic group. Whatever it is, there are a whole gamut of ideals that control human behavior. And if one then says, well, why should people care that much? Well, one answer might be because it's by means of the construction of ideals, whatever the ideals are to whatever people and however they pursue them, this is an expression of creativity on their part. Just to carry this a little further now, though we'll be talking about it more later on, one thing that's occurred to me recently is the phenomenon that in the 19th century in the United States, there were people whom we now look back on as robber barons, people who devoted themselves to amassing enormous fortunes, so much so that they left the money to foundations, to their children, and the foundations that their children were to create, to make, rather than doing anything with the money themselves. Above all, in the United States, they were generally very puritanical types who worked themselves into the graves. Why did they do that? I mean, somehow they couldn't even enjoy their money. Even if they had tried, they had so much, they couldn't have enjoyed it to that extent. But why didn't they have a more leisurely life when they made a little fortune? You don't need much to live a luxurious life. In a country that was so abundant as the United States, you'd really need very little. Even nowadays, you don't need much. They never thought that way. They thought about creating empires, of economic empires, developing whatever aspect of wealth that they had access to, making monopolies, because that for them was a way of getting more money. Why did they do that? Well, it was because they were driven by an ideal, the ideal being to create wealth, not just discover wealth, but to create it, to create institutions, to create corporations, to create a United States that would go from the East Coast to the West Coast. These were all creative ideals on the part of very pedestrian, dreary people who would never have thought of themselves as idealists, and yet who fought very hard and were willing in many cases to engage in economic warfare, which sometimes involved violence against workers or others who opposed their plans. All of this with the idea that eventually it would go to their children and the foundations that would distribute the money in a moral way, an equitable way, or religious way, and most of them were very religious. A great deal of human behavior is explained in terms of ideals, and my subsequent question is, why do people go to the trouble? Why is imagination so important, and why are the pursuit of ideals so important, specifically to human beings, particularly ideals that don't bring happiness, that don't bring peace, that don't often achieve what people think they want to achieve? And the only solution I can get is that through creativity there is a kind of consummation that you can't get more directly by means of anything else, so that the payoff, as I say in the chapter, the payoff for imagination and idealist is consummation. That chapter, which you're going to be reading next week, so we'll go on a little more about it, starts out asserting that traditional philosophical explanations of behavior in terms of pleasure are naive, because there isn't any one thing that can explain all of the hedonic, that is, desirable feeling that go to human behavior. So pleasure is one, but then there are other things that have to be analyzed and distinguished from sheer pleasure. Pleasantness, enjoyment, satisfaction, a sense of fulfillment. And often you can fulfill yourself not by having anything like pleasure, enjoyment, satisfaction, but by dying, by fighting to the death. There is a kind of fulfillment that you get by pursuing your ideals to the point where you have to give your life for them. I mean, it's true, after you've done that, you don't feel very good. You don't have any consummation. But what's motivating you in the meantime is the consummatory sense that I'm doing the right thing. I'm doing what I believe in. I'm doing what matters to me. I'm making life more meaningful. You don't say that, but that's what's happening. The need to make life meaningful is deeply ingrained in human beings because we have an intellect, unlike other animals, that shows us all the hazards of life. Most animals don't think about death. They don't think about wasting their time because they're lying in the sun all day doing nothing at all. It's people who have intellects who have that kind of response. And as a compensation for the sense of meaninglessness that comes from the intellect showing you that you're worthless in terms of whatever ideals have been imparted to you that you've grown up to or that you yourself believe in, that you're not living up to your own ideals, we seek out ways of making life more meaningful. And it's out of that sense of meaningfulness that comes from various aspects of life that we get the consummatory sense that makes the efforts of imagination and idealization worthwhile. Now, those activities are supremely creative, and so out of an analysis of that sort, you can derive all of the things that we usually associate with creativity in art, science, and technology. So you see how all of these concepts and distinctions are interwoven. One example that I spent a good deal of time on, as you'll find in the chapter, is Socrates, the forefather of all Western philosophy. He never wrote anything. He stood around in the marketplace and talked to young men. Women weren't allowed to develop their minds, so there was nothing much to say to them. He was married. He had 4 children, but so it's not as if he didn't know what a woman was like, but the ones he wanted to talk to and exchange ideas with were men. That was characteristic of that society. What he was trying to do was to help people clarify their ideas. For me, that's a great tradition. I think of philosophy as helping people to make their own ideas clear. And then once you've done that, you can go out and live. You can pursue studies on your own. You can be totally different from me, but I would have helped you as a philosopher to make your ideas clear. He was put to death during the Peloponnesian War, partly because some of his pupils went out and did things that the state considered tyrannous, not just tyrannous, but treacherous, that they were undermining the Athenian state at a time that Athens was having a hard time in its struggle with Sparta. So they blamed this old man who was standing there and accused him of corrupting the youth. They also accused him of vilifying the gods by getting people to think about religion. He was not. He claimed in his defense that he was not irreligious, and far from corrupting the youth, he was helping to liberate them and make them good Athenians. He went to death by drinking hemlock, that being the way in which people were executed, a kind of a willed and accepted suicide. He could have escaped, but he didn't, and there are various dialogues that Plato recites in which Socrates discusses his trial and his coming death. So he was a philosopher from beginning to end. Why? Because what could be a greater consummation of the field that you're using your powers to the fullest? If you have the talent that he has, if you care enough about your state, your country, and in fact Socrates had fought in wars before and risked his life. He was now old, he was 70 years old, he couldn't do that anymore, but he could help the state by educating the young. There must have been a tremendous fulfillment of himself as a human being and as a patriot. It has nothing to do with pleasure. It isn't a question of drinking the hemlock because you like the taste, and therefore all the typical hedonistic analyses of human behavior in the Western world seems to me to be very short-minded and impoverished. And by introducing the concept of consummation, I open up that way of thinking and deal with it very broadly. There's another book of mine that came out the same year that this one came out. It's called Sex, a Philosophical Primer. It was listed in the books by Irving Singer at the beginning of Feeling and Imagination. In that book, I take the analysis even further in talking about sex, not merely in terms of pleasure, but in terms of a great many related concepts which have to be distinguished from pleasure in order to deal with some of the problems that sexuality poses for a philosopher. All right. Well, that's what I wanted you to read for next time, and I look forward to all of your discussion. Next on the list is a distinction that's made sometimes between intuition and instinct, intuition being thought to be closer to explaining the nature of creativity. The great 20th century French philosopher Henri Bergson, B-E-R-S-O-N, I discussed a little because he makes that distinction very sharp and then goes on to a theory of creativity that I want to discuss later on. I also talk about the Platonic idea of creativity consisting in the search for perfection, and perfection being related to the metaphysics of Plato. And as against that, I posed a more pragmatistic empirical approach, which says that even in the question of love, which is fundamental in Plato's philosophy, you can often love somebody not because he or she is perfect, that in fact can get in the way of your love, but rather because he or she is imperfect, and you can help to overcome that, so that there's something wrong in the whole orientation of Plato. Now, as the rest of you probably know, I've written, I don't know, eight books at least on love and sexuality, and a great deal on Plato, who is, for me, the greatest philosopher who ever lived, and a tremendous inspiration for someone like me who totally disagrees with him. I developed that idea very far, but not sufficiently in terms of creativity itself, and that's what I want to be doing with you. Now we get toward the end of the presentations. I don't remember that I said very much about time, creativity in relation to time. I'll come back to it in a moment. I just want to say here that there are certain views about creativity that sort of limit it to a sudden inspiration. A good example of that is the creativity of a great scientist like Archimedes. You all remember what he's famous for, taking a bath and jumping up and running nude through the streets because, eureka, I found it, right? Do any of you know the circumstances in which that kind of exhibitionism, flashing, isn't that what you call it? Flashing took place? So I'll tell you. The king of the city-state had a crown which had an irregular shape, the way crowns do, right? And it was made of gold, and he didn't know what the crown was worth, because he didn't know what the volume of the crown was. Savi is nodding. Do you know the rest? Well, why don't you tell him?
Some sort of calculation he did to discover the true weight.
And how did he discover it?
Displacement. Displacement of water.
Displacement of water, that's right. Nobody had been able to solve that problem, including Archimedes, until he was taking a bath once, and he noticed that when he got in and out, the level of the water changed, as you know, so that his own volume showed itself in the displacement of water when he was in the bath, and so he jumped out because he had found the solution, and all he had to do was to put the king's crown in water and then calculate what its weight was. That's a sudden inspiration. That one might think of as sort of characteristic, paradigmatic about the nature of creativity, right? As against that, what I suggest is that even that isn't instantaneous, that the passage of time has a very intimate relationship to the nature of creativity. I'll come back to that shortly, because there's a heading a little further down that encompasses that. Another thing we talked about briefly was the importance of our vegetative being. I don't know which class it was, and with Nick, was it the first? I did talk about that, our vegetative being.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sort of thing you would remember. And very briefly, I repeated something I do in a chapter of a book called The Harmony of Nature and Spirit, and there's several chapters on the nature of happiness. One chapter is called Beyond the Suffering in Life, and my argument there is that people neglect the extent to which we live as vegetative creatures. I even say we are vegetables, and that's shocking because, you know, we're not cabbages and pears and strawberries, but we have a vegetative being, of which we're usually not aware. At every moment in our lives, our digestive system is working. You never think about that unless you have a stomach ache or, you know, one of those ailments that the television ads are always giving you remedies for.
Irritable bowel syndrome?
What?
Irritable bowel syndrome?
No, reflex. I'd never heard of it before.
Reflex?
Yeah,
Acid reflux.
I'd never heard of it except in terms of that product, and I've never experienced. So this was a very, you know, television can be very instructive. Ordinarily, we're not at all aware about our digestive system. There are cultures in which digestion is very important. So Italian children, French children, those are two in particular I know about, are taught that it's very important to digest your meal. And a lot of the culture centers about that, and they're right. Whether or not you've instructed in that, if you have a good life, you will naturally arrange for the digestive system to work in an acceptable fashion. We're not aware of it, though, and yet that's what we are. And my point there is that one of the paths to happiness is to accept ourselves as creatures who have a vegetative being, so that you accept the fact that you are not totally different from a tree or a plant. They're stationary vegetables, or literal vegetables are stationary until they're plucked, and we are mobile. We're not only that, but that is part of what it is, what we are. Now, having established that in that chapter in Harmony in Nature and Spirit, what occurred to me later now is that that may be a key to the nature of creativity. That being creative is a function of having certain vegetative processes operating in a way that will provide fruitful ideas, and even the phrase fruitful, a fruitful idea, that's certainly referring to the vegetative aspect of things. Fruitful ideas that develop in you, that grow in you. We talk of processes of growth. Tyler, I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to add in, it's something that takes time to...
And that takes time.
Yeah.
That's right. That's my point. And I'll come back to the time function. But what I just wanted to finish now was the idea of it's being part of our vegetative being, operating well. If it operates badly, then somehow you'll be in a state of malaise and not likely to be very creative. Especially, and this is another topic that we'll come to later, if you think of creation or creativity in terms of having a good life being a creative act, that it's not just making paintings that other people give you money for, or musical compositions, or grand scientific theories as an example of creativity. Why wouldn't living a good life be a creative act? Nietzsche, in his final phase, way beyond anything the Nazi could even understand or appreciate, thought that the Superman, the Übermensch, that the Nazis glorified because they thought he was a military conqueror who would tread on the heads of inferior races. That wasn't Nietzsche's idea at all. And as it became clear from his final writings that were collected only long after he died, the Superman is the artist. He's the man who's able to create things. And the greatest act of creativity is to create a good life. Now, if that's true, then the passage of time is a way of enabling you to develop in the direction of creativity, partly because of your vegetative the processes of the vegetative processes working properly in you. That it goes against the idea of creativity being this spontaneous event like Archimedes shrieking Eureka. That might exist, but it has to be seen in the perspective of something that takes much more time. And even if you think about a little more about Eureka and Archimedes, you know, he wasn't a guy who just got into a bath. He was a scientist. He was a man whose processes of ratiocination, of reasoning, and of collecting evidence and thinking about this took a good deal of time. So that thinking is itself a time-consuming activity that grows and develops. At this point, I can't resist telling you an anecdote about a colleague of mine whom you wouldn't have heard of because he died prematurely, 55. His name was George Boulos. He was an important logician at MIT. And we had something in common because he had been at Wadham College when I was at Oxford, and I knew the warden of Wadham, he's called, the warden of Wadham very well, who was the legendary Oxford figure. And Boulos told me the story of his walking through the arcades as an undergraduate thinking about something. And I knew from acquaintance that when he thought, he was in a kind of trance. He was a logician, he was a mathematician, he was thinking without observing around him too much. He was thinking about the concepts, mathematical or other concepts that he was focusing on. One day, this famous aloof warden, master of the college, head of the college, walked by him in the arcades, and without hardly stopping, he looked over and said, "Thinking?" And Boulos just kept on going. About 2 or 3 weeks later, they were in the same position in the arcade with the warden hurrying past, and this time when he looked over, he said, "Still thinking?" Well, that's it. Thinking is not something that just happens to you. It's a function of time. It's something that grows in you and develops in you, and that is the basis of all education. That in the course of thinking, you will develop into capacities, levels, areas that you could never have reached all at once. It takes time for this to occur. And that is part of the creative process. That's how you create yourself as a fully fledged thinker. It leads me to the further idea, which I can't remember whether I mentioned, that if you really are an artist, a creative artist, you don't sort of do your job at the moment only. I mean, if you're a writer, you're always thinking in terms of words. Poets particularly, but anybody who's really interested in good writing, who's a stylist. A good deal of my life goes into my writing, and I think I'm primarily an author. And I find that walking over the bridge, I live in the Back Bay, my mind is always filled with words and little phrases, and then meanings that I can possibly use in something that I believe in and may even be writing or may not be writing. But there is this active fermentation always going on, and in my case, very largely in terms of words. Now, words are not enough for me because I think of good style as a function of a sense of the music in what you write. That to write well, you have to realize that it sounds right. Otherwise, there's some confusion in your thought. So I could be whistling or thinking, and that's all part of what's going on. Not that I'm going to be writing an opera or I'm doing one of these in isolation. They're somehow related. But what I'm primarily thinking about are the words. And this is a matter of time, fermentation, development that occurs to me in a writer. Painters, I think, must be the same. Musicians, the same. Probably scientists. Scientists mull a great deal. And so this, not just the passage of time and the acceptance of one's vegetative being, in which this is all being used for some organic purpose, though that purpose can be aesthetic or scientific, but also the fact that it takes time for it to develop in you is very important in understanding the nature of creativity. This leads me to a big topic, which I'll try not to talk too much about because I see it's almost 3 o'clock already, but I do want to go on. And if you don't mind, I probably should take another half hour. Is that acceptable?
Oh yeah, that's fine.
No, first of all, I want you to come in and to discuss as much as possible, and that's exactly what I'm leading toward, but there's no reason for you not to start right now if you want. My hope is that you'll do it more freely once you have this kind of preparation. Am I right? But you all do feel to discuss, and the value of the course will depend on your ideas as they develop in you, and that means you're discussing them, and again over a period of time, because that will make it more valuable. Another part of this emphasis upon time is that a subplot, the belief that I have that it's only by being criticized that one ever develops. Now, I mean, I don't mean somebody who's tearing you to shred or you're being criticized by an idiot or maliciously, but it's only when people point out your shortcomings, your mistakes, your clumsiness, your inability to handle the problem in a way that you yourself would consider acceptable, that you ever do develop. And I always think of a saying about the stock market, that is that a bull market, one that's going up, always mounts on a wall of worry. That it's only because of the interference that you get from that wall that you're able to advance. And in the case, it's very apt for the stock market, because for everybody who buys something and therefore drives up the price, there has to be somebody who's selling it because he doesn't think the price is going to go up. So that it's that kind of dialectic between positive and negative attitudes towards the commodity that a market exists, and that people who make money are able to make money if they happen to be on the right side at the right moment. All right? Well, the same thing is true about our minds and our mental development. You learn by being criticized and being self-critical. If you're too self-critical, then you smother your ability to develop. If people never question anything you say, you're not going to learn very much. It's going to be very boring. Whenever I read a review or there's some comment about me, and if it's favorable, I think, isn't that nice? But if it's a criticism that isn't hostile, because you can't do anything with that, but that really shows some understanding of what I was doing, and an honest attempt to attack me, to get beyond me, to show what I'm missing, that's where I learn. That's how I learn. So that is something that I relish more. But it's of a different sort. I relish being loved and everyone saying, aren't you wonderful? But that's not the point. For the sake of my own development, the kind of approach that I relish is the one in which I am challenged. Now that takes time, because you have to be challenged time and time and time again in order for you to advance time and time and time again. As a further, this is getting far afield, I had lunch today with somebody who teaches in the writing program. And as I was saying to her, that it's only after I go through many, many drafts of anything I write that I finally want to show it to anybody, and many more before I'm willing to let it get printed, published, assuming there's a publisher who wants to print my stuff. And even at the very last moment, when the galleys are in, and it will cost a lot of money to change the text, I try to make last-minute changes that are not going to cost anything, because I never feel I've reached perfection. Then find it's published, it's out of my life, and I go back maybe to think about that book, and I think, maybe that could have been done better. I learned from my own imperfections in a way that I couldn't have at an earlier period of time. So time is very important, I think, in the whole nature of creativity. It's something for you to think about. All right, I also wanted to relate this to the nature of learning. Maybe I'll have to leave that early. I'll say a few things, but there's a great deal, I have quite a lot in my notes about learning, that a theory of creativity of the sort that I'm trying to create, thanks to you listening to me and eliciting these ideas out of me, because as you can see, this is not preformed lecturing of something that I've already published. This is being creative thanks to the importance of you as human beings to whom I can communicate. There are many human beings I can't communicate. I love MIT students because they can see through me instantly and understand everything I say, and that forces me to think in ways that are very helpful to me. So that the process is a learning process and a creative process. And what I now am beginning to think that all learning is creative, that it's only by means of creativity that we're able to learn anything. How can that be? You all sit in on courses, let's say in engineering or certain aspects of science, in which there's a lecturer who has a kind of textbook that he's writing or has written, and he's instructing you on, let's say, how to build a bridge. And if you don't do it the right way, the bridge will fall down. If you do it the right way, it'll stay up, and you've got to do it that way, the right way. Where's the creativity in that? There's a great deal of science and a great deal of life that is purely mechanical. But we talk about the mechanics at the beginning of a class. These are the mechanics, these are the rules that are being laid down. It doesn't seem to be anything creative in formulating and imparting that kind of information. Information itself would seem to be less creative than what you get from a work of art, because it's there, it's formed, it's transferred. We transfer information. But that's not the way we learn. The transference of information is not the same as learning. When I was in my life, I've taken only one course in physics. It was as a freshman at Harvard many, many years ago. I don't know if you would even remember the name of the great man who was the lecturer in physics. And I got an A in the course. And immediately afterwards, I said to myself, but what have you learned? I don't think I've learned anything about physics. I got an A in the course, but I didn't know what physics really was about. And I never took another course in physics for good reason, because I just didn't have enough talent. I had lots of talents for getting A's, and that's what I did in that course. But that's not what it is to learn. That's going through the mechanical process of satisfying the expectations of whoever gives you the grade, or imparts the information on the basis of which you can get an A. There was a famous psychoanalyst, well, I think it was famous. I knew him very well. For many years at MIT, he was the head of the psychiatric service, and he wrote a book on. I've forgotten the title of the book. It was about an MIT education from the point of view of his observations as a psychiatrist. This book was published 30 years ago, at least, and the burden of it was that students at MIT are taught how to succeed as students at MIT. They're taught how to get the kinds of grades that will send them out into the world. I assume things have changed a great deal since then, but this is a characteristic way in which a great deal of higher education and even lower education is imparted. Learning a mechanical method that can satisfy your place in society or give you a better place in the future. But to learn the subject, to learn how to think, to learn how to deal with life's problems or to deal with the real problems of physics or any science, or the real problems of building bridges, which is more than just seeing to it that they don't fall down. That takes something else. That takes time, and it takes a kind of acquisition of creativity that occurs in the process, and the question is, how does it occur? And one of the conclusions I reach, and I won't go any further because there are many conclusions, is that learning, what is creative in learning, results from a student teaching himself or herself whatever it is he or she wants to learn, as inspired by respect and admiration for somebody who's already gone through this process and has learned how to excite that kind of interest on the part of the students. So that the creativity in learning really occurs in what's happening to the student, but it doesn't occur in isolation. It occurs in the presence of others and under circumstances that a creative teacher will have installed in place, so to speak, to enable the students to learn. I suppose this is related to the ideas of progressive education, and the creator of that was the great philosopher whom I mentioned before, John Dewey. And John Dewey was very much interested in the nature of creativity. Any of you who want to write on a philosopher on creativity, I'll be happy to steer you to the relevant works of John Dewey. He died in 1952. He's not contemporary, but when he was alive, he was the most important philosopher in the English language, pretty much. So what I say is the student learns by acquiring the teacher's ability to learn. That's a shorthand of that enormous topic. Then I go on to something else that Kessler, the author, Arthur Kessler, the author of the book I mentioned, The Act of Creation, The Act of Creation. He says that the art of forgetting is very essential in the nature of creativity. If we didn't forget a great deal, we would never be able, I suppose, never be able to remember what we do remember, because there would be just too much information coming in, but we wouldn't be able to deal with it in a creative way. And he gives some examples from creative people, including one or two that I like especially about Edison. Let me read to you. All right, this is a direct quote from Kessler. He says, the prerequisite of originality in the art is the art of forgetting. The prerequisite of originality is the art of forgetting. At the proper moment, what we know. Without the art of forgetting, the mind remains cluttered up with ready-made answers and never finds occasion to ask the proper questions. Notice this gets beyond that truism that I was saying about the mind getting too much information. What's more interesting, what I just quoted Kessler saying, is that the mind gets cluttered up with ready-made answers rather than being original. So it's a question of the originality, not just the ability of the mind to digest so much information. At a time when Edison's inventions were transforming the pattern of our civilization, his ignorance of scientific theory raised criticism and opposition, especially among highly trained scientists and engineers without inventive talent. Edison was said to have carried the art of forgetting to such extremes that on one occasion, when he had to queue at New York City Hall to pay his taxes, and an official suddenly asked him his name, Edison could not at the moment remember it and lost his place in the queue. Close quote. Actually, it reminds me of one of the Sherlock Holmes stories in which Dr. Watson mentions to Holmes the distance between the Earth and the Moon. And Holmes nods and said, "That figure is something I will immediately forget. What possible use can it be to me? Why should I care? Why should I want to know that?" I think that's relevant. Now, there may have been things that Holmes neglected and forgot that he should have kept in mind, but what he was illustrating was the fact that if you're going to have an inventive, creative, pointed ability to perceive details that will solve a detective's problems, you don't want your mind filled with all of this irrelevant information. And so that, I think, is worth exploring, too, how the art of forgetting may be one of the bases of creativity. Now, there's another subject that I want to go on to, which is that creativity, if one can make sense of it, should also be explicable of human behavior. That's related to what I was saying about the creativity necessary to live a good life. And in these notes, I have virtually a little essay, which I hope someday to rework and rework and rework and put into that part of the book on creativity. I won't bore you with that, and I probably won't come back to it later in the term, but I want to mention it here. I choose as a practical question, a question that was very live at the time that I was writing and that I didn't do anything with. I had been invited by the University of Amsterdam Medical School to give them a lecture when I was lecturing in Belgium, and so it would have been a little detour. And I turned it down because I was overcharging my system and doing too much. And so I thought, I'll leave this for another time. And so I said no. And then I went away thinking maybe I should have given them. I could have created something that might be of interest to them. And I still haven't gone back. But in that absence, feeling there was an opportunity missed, I started thinking about a problem that was lively at the time, namely the problem of assisted suicide, as a practical problem that doctors have to face. And in fact, in the Netherlands, they faced it more than I think in any other country, because the Netherlands has experimented with different kinds of way of dealing with it, sometimes in terms of euthanasia, sometimes not, and they're very much alert and sophisticated about the need to control doctors from making mistakes, by encouraging suicides, by not processing the situation of a patient who says, I want to commit suicide, will you please help me? You know, all of those complications in it. And what I then wrote was this little essay in a first draft about the different attitudes towards, from a philosopher's point of view, the different attitudes towards this as a practical problem. What I ended up with, not knowing that my mind was already broaching this book, this material on the nature of creativity, what I said was, the big mistake is to assume that a practical pursuit like being a doctor, the medical field, is a science. It's not a science, nor is it an art like other arts. It's based upon creativity of a very special sort. And therefore, instead of looking for a yes or no answer that'll apply to every case, perhaps the only solution to the problem is to train doctors to be capable of a creative response to the dimensions of any particular case. Right? And that was sort of my solution. Now, thinking about it now, the trouble with that solution is that if you can't create creative people very easily, how are you going to be sure that the doctors that you process with this freedom to make that decision for or against a doctor-assisted suicide, that they're going to be creative? How can you control them? How can you properly train them? We're in a kind of very primitive state in the development of the human race, where even the philosophers can't even imagine what to do with a problem like that, and all the legislators and all of the suffering people involved. You know, our mentality, our state of evolution, in terms of this kind of development, is very limited. And of course, in terms of evolution, the little sliver that is what we call human nature is primitive. It's very young. It's very short-lived. It hasn't gone very far. Maybe in 1,000 years this is possible. And so one has to decide, is it worth taking the risk with backward creatures, humanoids of the sort that we are? But, so that's the trouble with my suggestion. But in terms of a kind of philosophical principle to hold aloft and then let the world work its way toward or against, for or against this idea, that was the best I could do at the time. And that would be an example of questions of creativity being related to an actual practice. Having said that, however, I now want to say maybe that's true of all practice. It's not just what a doctor goes through. It's what every carpenter goes through, because he isn't a machine. He is a maker of machines, and even if he has lathes to turn out his table, he is responsible for the operation of the lathe, and therefore he has a creative involvement in what happens to the machine. This in turn leads into questions that you all by now more and more sophisticated about the creativity of computers. Computers are machines, and yet they think in a sense, or they don't think. They can be made to respond to human beings who think. How can we be creative? How can we not? The first year that I gave this course, which was 2 years ago, I and the class and I read something that I highly recommend to you. It's a book that Marvin Minsky in Artificial Intelligence is writing. You all know the name Marvin Minsky, don't you? Mm-hmm. And some of you may have read his book, what's the title of his book?
Is it The Creative Mind? Or
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Creative Mind? I don't know. I'm not sure.
I don't know if it's creative. I've forgotten it now, too. It's a title that's very suggestive of his interests in artificial intelligence. Well, first? Let's stop. Who's going to give the presentation next week? So far, Joe and today Nick are the only ones who have. Who will do it next week on consummation?
I'll do it.
Okay, Tyler. One of your jobs is to get the exact title of Marvin Minsky's book to start out with. The book came out in the middle 1980s, and he's been writing a sequel, but he does it on the internet, and he does it that way because he wants to encourage his people, which is you who live on the internet, to respond to the ideas that he puts out, and the responses come into the book. He answers them. They're recorded on the internet, and it seems to me like a wonderful way to write a book if you're that kind of person with that kind of audience and that kind of mentality. I don't know that I could do it, but I find his doing it very exciting. The book is called The Emotion Machine. It's relevant to studies in AI and to studies about computer science, and it I forget now how I got into this, actually. Does anyone remember? Oh, I know. That possibly in all of life there is an element of creativity because we are responsible for the things that we make, the machines that we make, and that this is especially relevant to you because an important thing in your life and in my life is that thing which is the computer. And someone like Minsky is very, very sophisticated about that and has this whole book about the emotion machine, how machines might or might not have emotions, how we who are people can learn about our own emotions, can learn as a chapter, I think, on imagination, because several of these chapters haven't yet been written. They're just numbers or partly written in first drafts, and as time goes on he writes more and keeps putting in more drafts. It's a wonderful way of proceeding, except that it seems to be taking a long time for him to finish this book. That's something you may all want to use as a resource for your own papers and your own research in this course. You can get onto that book by calling up Minsky's email address in, what is it, Minsky at
media.mit.edu.
media, is that it?
Yeah, media.mit.edu.
That's right. Minsky at media.mit.edu, and on the right-hand side under the links, you'll see the emotion machine, and then you click on that, and you'll get whatever state that book is in. And I'd be fascinated to know what you think of it and how you can use it. Another problem in creativity that I can go over very quickly right now is the fact that we talk about creativity in different media, but maybe there isn't any one creativity. Maybe every medium has its own form of creativity. Maybe it really means almost something different from one to the other. So that we know that creativity in music means one thing. Does that mean that creativity in painting and literature, and of course in a non-art like science, is that going to mean the same thing even in science? Is creativity in mathematics the same as creativity in chemistry? So one has to analyze with greater powers of distinction what the different kinds of creativity might be. Or even within a subclass like literature. Is creativity in tragedy going to be the same as creativity in comedy? Is creativity in a melodrama, different from creativity in a tragedy? Could very well be. So we need much more analysis, and having the more panoramic ideas of creativity might take us part of the way, but we need much more sophistication. Is the creativity in lyric poetry the same as creativity in non-lyric poetry? There are different rules. There are different techniques, different styles. And what about the difference between Baroque and Romantic style? There's a different kind of creativity. So that once you start analyzing creativity, the distinctions seem to be almost endless. And nobody has really done that properly. Over and above all that, there are questions about a formal definition. I myself don't think definitions are too important to philosophy. Most philosophers think that if you give a definition of X as Y, then you've done something, and from that you can derive Z, because Y implies Z, and then you have a kind of mode of inference to go from various premises to various conclusions. I'm not that kind of philosopher anymore. I was trained that way when I was an analytical philosopher in graduate school and shortly afterwards. But since then, my feelings have been that life defeats those procedures. Life is much more complex. Life is more chaotic. And that even in a subject like, or above all in a subject like the one that I then became wedded to, the nature of love, I can see any fruitfulness in defining it in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions or too minutely. Instead, what I ended up doing in these 8 books I mentioned to you, and 2,500 pages or whatever, and it keeps on going, was making distinctions none of which will be complete, all of which will be a partial insight or perspective into this enormous concept with this very vague language that is related to this part of human nature. It's so enormous, it defies any one definition. Or if there is possibly a narrow definition, it's not going to take us very far. It'll have a slight interest, as I'll illustrate in a moment, but it won't solve the really important life's problems, which is the reason why most people go into philosophy. Once they're in, they become technicians, and then they forget why they went in. And they don't get tenure for being interested in life's problems, usually, nowadays in particular. They get tenure for being faster, smarter, better technicians than anybody else within a particular narrow part of it that their colleagues respect enough to get them this kind of job. Nevertheless, philosophy as I see it and aspire toward is one in which people become very sophisticated about making of distinctions that are important in life, that can be made precise without being totally definitive, and are of a kind that most people don't even think about because they don't think at this level of what I consider to be philosophy. I mention this as a preparation for giving you one definition that is related to something on your partial reading list. Incidentally, I call it a partial research list because I don't expect you to go ahead and read all this plus more. I don't mean it's partial reading list that's required. None of it's required, but all of it can be useful to you. More could too, but you work your way through it in any way that is meaningful to you. Most of the books are in the library, or I have them out, so that you pick and choose. Now, one of the books on that list is a book edited by Margaret Boden, B-O-D-E-N, called Dimensions of Creativity. And she has a chapter in that collection of writings. It's called What is Creativity? She gives a definition of creativity in terms of inventiveness of two sorts. One inventiveness is superficial, and another and exploratory. That's the term that she uses, so that you investigate in a way that other people haven't to get some new ideas, but they're not necessarily profound ideas. And she illustrates that by comparing the music and style of Haydn, who was a great composer, with the music and style of Mozart, who is sort of supreme and a Shakespeare of music, one of a kind. And she says that this innovative capacity that they both have of exploring in regions of what has already been established is common to both of them. But in the case of Mozart, there is a transformational kind of inventiveness that takes him much further than Haydn, and that shows us what true creativity is. Now, people who recognize the greatness of Haydnists might quibble about that. That's something to be resolved by yourselves or by doing more research. But I wanted to give you that distinction that she makes between the exploratory and the transformational sense of inventiveness, the latter of which being more clearly creative than the former. And I turn to her now because I want to read to you something that she quotes as being highly creative and highly transformational. And it's a wonderful example. She really hits the nail with this one, I think. It's 4 lines out of Shakespeare's play Macbeth, which is relevant to the fact that Lady Macbeth walks in her sleep. She's a somnambulist and wipes her hands and shows signs of psychiatric distress, of grief, and we know why, because she's feeling guilty about having murdered Duncan and other people the way her husband did. And the lines are as follows: sleep that knits up the raveled sleeve of care, the death of each day's life, sore labor's bath, balm of hurt minds, great nature's second course, chief nourisher in life's feast. That's out of context, but her point is that these metaphors are very, very imaginative. Who would have thought of comparing sleep to a bath? Or the beautiful line about sleep that knits up the raveled sleeve of time. So sleep sort of mends what is troubling you because you're oblivious to the nature of the trouble. It's like a sleeve that needs to be mended, and sleep does that. Also, what I noticed immediately is something that is implausible, that I find untrue to life, and therefore more exciting, more transformational, the idea of the death of each day's life. Now, I don't think myself that sleep is a form of death. For me, sleep is a very important part of life. And in fact, in the book I mentioned on happiness, harmony of nature and spirit, I say that some of the happiest moments in my life occurs as I'm awakening to a kind of consciousness that I had before I fell asleep and I didn't have during the sleep. There's something in that in-between period that for me is sort of blissful. I think it's a way of my saying, look, I'm still alive. But the reason I can say that is because when you're asleep, you are still alive. sleep is not a process different from life. This is related to theories about creativity in terms of the unconscious, particularly the Freudian unconscious, which is a separate realm according to Freud. I don't want to get into that today, but I don't believe in those. I don't think that sleep is different from the rest of life. It's the brain that's working. The brain is a kind of all-night cafe. It's open all the time. The nerve endings are there. They're operating. The digestive juices, the vegetative system, not the motor system because you're lying down, but that's true when you're resting. But there isn't a death that occurs in sleep. There isn't an unconscious to be explained apart from your waking life. Sleep is a part of your total existence. It's a part of your organic being. And the importance of sleep is that if you can't sleep happily, you're diminishing yourself, and therefore there's something wrong, and that has to be taken care of. To live well is to sleep well, at least part of the time. I don't mean that you have to sleep without waking up. You can get up. And there are all sorts of variants about good sleep, but it's one thing to have a good night's sleep, most of the time at least, and never to have a good night's sleep. It's one thing to be walking in your sleep like Lady Macbeth because she is racked by guilt and therefore afraid that somebody is going to catch her, or that guilt feelings are based on the fear of being apprehended. It's another thing to have a good night's sleep. But in either event, what it is a function of the rest of your life and your life as an organic totality. So that it isn't a death. Death is something else. Death is extinction, unless you believe there's another life, but then that raises a totally different question, whether we should believe that, whether our religion and what the focus of that religion, but limiting ourselves to what we know is our life. Sleep is not the death of it. It is rather an important part of it. Here's Shakespeare speaking of it as the death of each life, which I'm now questioning. Immediately afterwards, he calls it sore labor's bath. And that's true because if you're sleeping, you're resting. And the mind is resting, it's awake, it's alive, it's not awake or you wouldn't be sleeping. It's alive, but it's resting. It's like you closing your eye during the day and taking a rest. There are some people, it just occurs to me, Edison, who is the example of forgetting, who didn't sleep much at all at night. I didn't know how much he slept, maybe 1 hour or 2 hours, very little. But during the day, he would take 5-minute naps, and that made up the deficiency. So that sleep in the middle of the night for 1 hour for someone like him is in principle probably not very different from those 5-minute naps. And that's all he needed. That's the way he operated. So that it's not a death of life, it's a resting of life. And therefore, using an analogy to bathing of labor, you've worked hard, and so you take a hot bath, and that loosens your muscles. The bath cures your aches and pains, and sleep can do the same. If you've worked hard, you sleep and wake up refreshed in the morning. So that's fine. But what are we to say about sleep is the death of each day? That doesn't seem right. But the fact that it doesn't can have its poetic effect as well. It's so extreme, it calls attention to certain things about sleep that resemble death, because sometimes people who sleep look as if they're dead, or you may be afraid they're never going to wake up, or they may be afraid they're never going to wake up. They're less belligerent, they're more immobile than they are in life, and so other people might think of that as being similar to death. In that limited respect, it isn't. It's not death in other ways, but the fact that it's so extreme and even so limited gave me the idea that the real creativity in these lines of Shakespeare consist in their not just being exploratory, but transformational. They're being extreme. And that there is a kind of creativity that neither Bowden nor Kessler, nor as far as I know anybody else, has said anything much about. And that's what I started developing some ideas about. And that is the idea of the absurd. Now that will lead us into something that Kessler does talk a lot about, and that's humor. And also that comes into Bergson's theories of creativity. What they don't emphasize as much as I would be that kind of absurdity which is funny. And as an example of that, I put into my notes a Jewish joke about two men who haven't seen each other for long times, were good friends in their youth, and one says to the other, how has life treated you? How's your life been? And he says, it's been good. I've had a good life. I've been happy. And he says, what about you? And the other one says, well, it hasn't been bad, but to tell the truth, if I had it all to do over again, I'd just as soon never have been born. And the other one says, yes, but who can be so lucky? All right? Now, if you find that funny, you see the humor, even if you don't enjoy it very much. It's because of the absurdity of that. What do you mean, who could be that lucky? You mean never to have been, you're happier than with the life you've had, but you're very lucky to be one of those who never was? But then how can there be happiness of any sort? What is the condition of never to have been? You might say and this is something to be discussed. I have a chapter in a book of mine called Meaning in Life, the Creation of Value, called The Nature of Death. The question is, what is death? And there is a view, which we all know, that you may or may not accept, which is that death is a total annihilation. That just is, it's absurd, to ask about what happens to the candle after it's been snuffed out. It's been annihilated. There isn't anything. There was a candle, there was a light, the light has gone out. Well, one view is the same is true about our human existence. We have the light of consciousness, we die, and since our mind depends on our body, everything goes out, right? You may not believe that, you may have all sorts of other views, and I'm not getting into them or questioning them right now. But what's truly absurd, even for people who don't accept that view, people who believe in all sorts of other views, is what is it never to have existed? And this isn't related to the Catholic idea of ensoulment. The Catholic idea of ensoulment is that God creates an infinite or a very large number of souls. They remain in heaven, the way souls are able to, until God has arranged for them to be instantiated, and then they get born. Then they become zygotes. They enter into life. And that's related to the whole question of abortion, because even if the zygote and the fetus are not persons, they are the embodiments of the souls, and the souls are eternal because God made them that way, and therefore to destroy a fetus or a zygote, to say nothing of destroying a young child, a fetus, is a murder, because you're destroying a special kind of human existence, right? All right, that's got nothing to do with it. Let's put aside the Catholic idea of ensoulment. How would you interpret somebody who says you'd be so lucky if you were never born at all? Or who's the you? I mean, what would it be if it had never been born? So it's absurd, right? Now my feeling there, and I'm just going to throw it out because it needs much more analysis, and we'll have to come back to it, particularly in relation to the nature of humor, is that creativity is revealed in the absurd. So that for Archimedes' contemporaries, it was be absurd to think that the weight of a crown could be determined by displacement of water. Or you want to find out what the crown weighs? Put it in water. That was an absurd idea. And we have all sorts of absurd ideas that an astronaut going off into space could come back younger than when he started out. Absolutely absurd. All of modern physics and modern science is built up out of that kind of absurdity in view of what our rational, commonplace thinking was prior to those developments in science. It's an absurdity to think that a woman could have both of her eyes on one side of her nose. Yet Picasso turns that absurdity into a work of art. He's saying something by means of the absurdity, and what he's saying is very creative. Nobody would have thought of that before. Or Braque and Cubist painters generally, who take ordinary objects that we recognize, that's a can of Coke, that's a book, so on, and then breaks them up into particles and mixes them around and makes a montage in which you don't see a face or a bottle or a book anymore, but parts rearranged. That's absurd, because when I look across the table, I don't see anything like that. But it's a way of saying something about the material world that we learn and recognize as a very creative, inventive gesture on the part of that artist. So the absurd, properly analyzed, and I haven't done it, nobody else has it, but maybe you can, takes us a good deal of the way to understanding the nature of creativity. I don't know how much, you see, now I have gone too much. I think I ought to stop here, but whatever more in the preparation I have can come out next week, and some of what I've been doing is more than just preparation. The point I wanted to make was that on all of these questions, there isn't any definition that will explain all of creativity. In a sense, I am a cubist and recommend that to you as a way of doing philosophy. By putting together these different perspectives and points of view, you get an insight into the reality, which you will then experience differently, and that will affect the creativity in your mind. And you'll get a feeling for what it is to be creative better than if you had a mechanical, cut and dried definition in terms of one or another necessary and sufficient conditions. And for me, that's a way of doing all of philosophy. You don't have to do it the way I do, but see whether it's of any use to you to have come into contact with it. All right, now I think we ought to take a little break, right? Mm-hmm. And Ramon, why don't you, Ramon, stop while we're taking the break, and then come back, and Nick will give a presentation of the reading for this week. Great. Nick Martinez will now give a presentation based on today's readings. And as in the case of all of your presentations, what's primarily needed is not just a summary, because in principle you're all doing the reading, but the creation of a discussion, which is a kind of creativity worth cultivating, in terms of ideas of your own or ideas of mine that you can't understand and think you should go beyond. Attack me, improve upon me in any way, please.
Oh, okay. Well, chapter 2 is on idealization, which is the making of ideals and the pursuit of ideals. And we consider ideals or idealization so we can understand its interplay between imagination and idealization to understand creativity. The chapter begins with a history lesson on Plato and other philosophers. Plato made the idealization the basis of his theory of love, and he thought idealization as a cognitive cognitive ability, dependent of feeling and imagination. So he thought that love and everything else developed from reason, and it was completely dependent from feeling and your imagination. But like noted in chapter 1, he forgets that his development of his idea is dependent on his own imagination. So he's kind of wrong in that sense, and therefore gets everything else that he develops down the line kind of incorrect.
Do you think I was being fair to Plato?
Yeah, I mean, he has to realize that his own ideas were a product of his own imagination. So if he just believes that everything can be explained by reason, and he makes that idea from his own imagination, he was already wrong. So,
but what if you had an uneducated man trying to tell you how to live? Wouldn't you say, well, his reason isn't sufficiently developed? It doesn't matter that he's very imaginative in his erroneous conception of the world. All we've got to do is to educate him, to train him, to show him the difference between ignorance and knowledge, between right and wrong, all sorts of things that come from developing a person's reason, not encouraging his imagination. Plato would say that's not the way to find out about reality. I mean, just relying on his imagination.
right, and you can't just make up anything you want. So you must have some type of interplay between imagination and reason in order to figure out the truth in life.
Okay.
Does anyone
Well,
else?
go on your own way. Don't let me interrupt you too much.
Oh, well, does anyone else want to answer any suggestions or comments? Okay. Well, yeah, feel free to jump in. Well, Plato also states that love alone reveals true idealization, and that all other types of affective relationships belong to a realm of appearance, which can never find reality in idealization, because appearance isn't perfect in goodness and beauty. So it's futilely just tries to seek this truth, but it never does. And the same idea is also seen as Plato's thoughts about sex and how it holds back a person from attaining higher interest. And he did this by recommending young adults to give in to all their urges early on in their life so they can try and extinguish that drive early on. So they can attain higher feats or higher ideas.
That's right. Going to MIT is not like being in high school.
Okay, and Nietzsche had a different idea, and he defended the idea of sexual love with the spiritualizing of sex, and how sex can actually be a physical response combined with a spiritual meaning to give rise to a higher state.
The relationship between spirituality and creativity, is something I want to discuss at length. Since I didn't, how does Nietzsche interpret spirituality?
Actually, I'm not really sure of that.
Well, he was anti-Christian. His idea is that Superman is not a saint. That Nietzsche is clearly an atheist. But spirituality is for him the kind of perfection within the dimensions of your being as a human being, within nature. So it's a very different concept of spirituality from the orthodox religious one. And that's what he means when he thinks of sex as a spiritualization of the senses, which is what I mentioned. He doesn't develop that very far. But you see, it's totally different from Plato, because for Plato, spirituality is not a cultivation and perfection of the senses, but rather a trajectory that takes you beyond the senses. And that's what Plato was one of the founders, in a sense, of Christianity. Christianity's dogma is based on Greek philosophy plus the Hebrew scriptures, the Bible. And what the Greek philosophy was that they cared about was Platonic ideas about a perfect realm beyond this world in which there would be pure spirit that one achieves by rising beyond the limitations of nature. That's not what Nietzsche's talking about, because he doesn't believe there is that other realm.
Okay. Well,
For him, the spirituality is the fulfillment of your potential within the natural order of things. See, so it's a total difference from Orthodox religion.
so Nietzsche believed that spirituality came from within, so it's kind of in the same realm. You can't go beyond your own senses. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and Freud also follows the same idea, although derived from Schopenhauer. Like Plato, they believe that empirical science can explain the medical-physical dualism that tells about the knowledge of reality, and that people actually delude themselves by reason. And they don't use reason to uncover truth, they just use it to hide reality. As an example, they say that sex is geared toward reproduction, and that Freud's idea of libido doesn't care about perfection of idealization. It just cares about reproduction. So it just goes toward any person that it sees and gears a person for sex. And so since love is also just aim-inhibited sex, it too is this, has the same idea that love is impure. It doesn't care about perfection. So it too also gears for just self-preservation.
Would anybody like a hard candy? My voice starts disappearing about this time without it.
Freud also stated that we overvalue the other person, and this is much as a survival mechanism, but we also falsify what we desire. So idealization is illusionary.
Mm-hmm.
And Schopenhauer talks about the will being random, with no goals or ideals, and it's also just part of self-preservation. So he sees will as evil because it exists with no meaning, since it's just towards self-preservation. It doesn't look for any truth. So, and sex again is just another means of self-preservation.
Well, what about actions of the will which have no progress toward reproduction?
Well, with not reproduction, but so you're saying every other action besides reproduction, or
Okay.
well, no.
Would you consider that desire? Is that what you mean? Like lust?
No, I'm saying anything that was completely unrelated to your preservation. Any activity of the mind.
But I guess that calls to question whether there are activities that are not related to your.
That's what I'm asking.
Yeah. I mean, I brought that up before.
Are you able to pick this up, Ramon? Okay. In general, present more. I mean, throw your voices a little more. But apparently there's no great problem.
Okay, so you're asking about thoughts of the mind that have nothing to do with preservation.
Well, I'm curious. I haven't read about this guy, but what is he? Can you tell me more about what he says?
Actually, I probably can't, since I've only read what's in the chapter, and I don't really know much about Schopenhauer and his other beliefs. But is anyone else?
I was hoping that you would take over. Well, you all feel free to talk, but if I get started, you've got to stop me. Tell me exactly what you're asking for in relation to which, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, or Freud, or all three of them?
Just Schopenhauer. I thought it was interesting when Nick said that he says the mind is evil. Because
the mind is evil.
The will.
The will is not evil in the sense of being intentionally bad. It doesn't have a mind. Right. It's just a field of force. You could translate a great deal of Schopenhauer in terms of contemporary science. You wouldn't want to say that the second law of electrodynamics is evil, or thermodynamics is evil. You would just say it's sort of merciless, or it has no concern about human welfare. And that's really what Schopenhauer is talking about, that the will to live, which is the vital force that we're all a part of, it's not something separate from us. We are the will because we're all living, and we manifest this vital sense, has no concern about the welfare of any individual, no concern about human ideals of good and evil, or better or worse. It's simply an impulse running through everything that's alive to stay alive, to be alive. It's the field of force that manifests the nature of life. It's evil in the sense, the metaphoric sense, that it is perfectly prepared to destroy people and to use them for purposes that they themselves don't, aspire toward. So the whole idea of love in Schopenhauer, present in the chapter called The Metaphysics of Sexual Love, or Love Between the Sexes, is that love is an attempt on the part of the will to stay alive in dimorphic creatures like us by inducing intersexual coitus, because that's the only way in which life goes on for us. In order to get the right man to mate with the right woman for the sake of the future generations that are beneficial to the continuance of life in the species, nature has contrived for them to fall in love. They fall in love thinking that it's only in the arms of the other person that they're going to find happiness. They fall in love thinking that only that person is worth bestowing energy upon, that she is the most beautiful of women, that he is the most handsome of men. This is characteristic of 19th century romantic love. And Schopenhauer says those who say that love doesn't exist or that it's unimportant are wrong. It's the most important thing. It's just that in order for it to be enacted, people have to be put into a state of illusion about the other object, and that's because that is beneficial to what the will wants, quote, wants, because the will isn't conscious, it doesn't want things the way we want them. The way in which the will is charged or motivated for the sake of reproduction. Now, if people suffer, and Schopenhauer thinks they do, because if you're living in illusion with a person that you eventually will find out is not what you thought he or she was, there's going to be a great deal of suffering. And so marriage is based upon passion, that is sexual ardor, that can lead to coitus, and in order for the coitus to be functional, it happens within a marriage. Such marriages are usually miserable. People end up giving birth to the next generation, but hating each other. The only kind of marriage that Schopenhauer says ever affords any kind of happiness are marriages of convenience, where you marry somebody because he's rich or she's rich, because it fits a political scheme that you believe in. That kind of marriage where passion is not the prime motive, that can sometimes be happy. But marriage is based on what lovers are hoping for in their passionate state. Those usually turn out badly. So there is an illusion which is evil or creates harm, creates a great deal of misery. Also, most of human life, according to Schopenhauer, is unhappy. People live and they give birth to future generations, but in conditions that are not capable of bringing about widespread happiness, and then they die. They're just as pawns of the will, and that's a tragedy. So in that sense, the will is evil. One could say most of this without bringing in that moralistic term, but it is representative of what Schopenhauer believes. Does that answer your question? Okay, then Nick can go on. But I'm eager to get your ideas. Not mine.
Okay. Schopenhauer also continues to state that compassion has a basis of morality, and that compassion is a feeling apart from love. Plato states that nothing is ruled by feelings and everything is ruled by all reason, so therefore he doesn't take into account compassion. And Freud also states that love can never benefit oneself, so he also just kind of tosses aside compassion because he doesn't believe that compassion. So since compassion would also benefit you as well, if you befriend someone, then
there is that big difference between Schopenhauer and Freud. That's true. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, a book Freud wrote in 1921, he talks about the search for death being instinctual in us, and that life seems to fit the Schopenhauerian pattern. What he doesn't recognize is that part of the Schopenhauerian pattern is Schopenhauer's belief that for some mysterious reason we are capable of transcending our own selfishness. Everything in nature is selfish because that's the way the will manages to stay alive, even if it's destructive of other entities that want to live. But Schopenhauer says somehow compassion can also come into it for human beings, and it's a mystery, and he doesn't know how to explain it. You know, one could say, well, he doesn't want to confess that he's self-contradictory in his naturalistic philosophy. For whatever reason, Schopenhauer constructs all of morality out of the fact that human beings are capable of compassion, which means a non-selfish concern about some other living entity. And that is not present in Freud. If you have that kind of love, for instance, love of humanity as such, love of suffering humanity, then that's a manifestation of some confusion or weakness on your part. Why do you do it? What's the good to you? In one of the later books of Freud, which is really a great masterpiece that everybody who graduates from college should be required to read, called Civilization and Its Discontents, he argues that the love of humanity does not make a person better. It does not strengthen him. It's just a confusion that prevents him from living the kind of healthy, strong life that comes by satisfying his own selfish impulses. So this is a problem for Freud, and he tries to handle it in his own way. Whereas for Schopenhauer, the problem is solved because the love of humanity is an illustration of compassion, and compassion is instinctual to us, he says. Why? He says, I don't know, but it is. And out of this, all morality springs. So the reason to do good would be because you have a concern about the harm that would come to other people and a compassionate desire not to allow that harm to occur. So there is that further complexity in Freud, in Schopenhauer that doesn't exist in Freud.
I have just one thought.
Elsa, what? I'm sorry.
I have just one quick thought. In a naturalistic sense, wouldn't compassion or the love of humanity just be another manifestation of man wanting to perpetuate his species? Because obviously you don't want to kill off your race, or then what's the point? So wouldn't that compassion kind of relate to it?
Why would you care about killing off the race after you're dead? I mean, you don't want to destroy them all while you're alive, but for the sake of living a good life yourself, it might be helpful to get rid of the ones who need your compassion. This has immediate practical ramifications in a democracy, because in a democracy there is an attempt to provide welfare for those who can't survive in a competitive capitalist system of the sort that we have. Well, those who have a good job and are surviving and are satisfied with their investments, if they wanted to, for purely selfish reasons, they could argue, well, let's get rid of those who are the underclass. They don't benefit us, and they don't benefit the society. Whereas the argument to someone who believes in compassion is that if they can't survive in this society, then we have to help them. We have to change society to that extent. So this gets to be a very important thing. And the point about the race as a whole, it's notorious that individuals and nations seem to care very little about the race. They just care about their own survival. Mm-hmm. Now, if you drop atomic bombs that destroy the race, then you're going to destroy all of the members of the race, including yourselves. So that's counterproductive. But it isn't because you are necessarily motivated by a concern about the race as such. Now, some people are, but then the question is, what would a one kind of naturalist of a sort that would follow from Freud's theory think about that compared to someone like Schopenhauer, who would say, in the process, you're destroying an important part of yourself because of the compassion which is the basis of all morality. Mm-hmm. Now, in practical terms, Freud was also a reformer. He was against, for instance, social laws that prevented people from enjoying their sexuality unimpaired. So he was in favor of divorce. He doesn't quite advocate adultery, but he says society is too harsh on those who commit adultery, and that all sorts of conservative laws about one's sexuality should be loosened in order to allow people to attain greater happiness. And then, of course, as a doctor, as a psychiatrist, he devotes himself to helping people to live a good life and to overcome their neuroses and get more happiness in their personal, intimate affairs. So it isn't as if he is a cold-hearted, reactionary or conservative, but the fundamental philosophical questions still would be different from those of Schopenhauer. As a matter of fact, Schopenhauer himself was much more conservative in his politics than Freud was. But by having that way of thinking of morality in terms of compassion, it seems to me it's a very different kind of philosophy from Freud's, who finds the civilization and its discontents as a result of the fact that people aren't sufficiently selfish in the way of loving themselves rather than loving other people. That's part of Freud's critique of Christianity. Christianity says, love your neighbors, love those who do harm to you. And Freud, belonging to a minority, people who were persecuted unfairly, the Jews, naturally, though he doesn't say that he's speaking as a Jew, replied, but they're trying to kill me and my people. Why should I love them for it? Why shouldn't I resist? Why shouldn't I fight against them? What kind of a religion is this that tells me to submit and to be passive and self-sacrificial in imitation of Christ? Schopenhauer doesn't think in those terms at all, while not being a Christian, being anti-Christian. He has a different fundamental theory of morals.
Okay. Schopenhauer continues to or states that ideals emerge from primal forces, and that they show themselves in human nature. And then imagination is the creative faculties that modify determinants of human nature. So imagination kind of changes the way that ideals emerge, and therefore both of them are interplayed to...
Whose idea is that?
That's your idea.
Right, okay. Do you agree?
Yeah, I would have to say that I agree that your own way of viewing the world is basically changes in how you create your ideals. So.
Anyone want to say, those who haven't yet read the chapter, of course, can't say much, but those who have, anything you would like to say that's critical of me, please? Please be critical of me.
Restate the idea. I didn't fully catch that.
You didn't quite hear what he was saying?
No.
You see, I think we're misled by Ramon being able to pick you up by turning the amplifier at the camera, because you have to project so the other end of the table will.
Okay.
I heard you, but Tyler didn't, so could you do it again?
Imagination is the creative faculties that modify determinants of human nature. So the idea that imagination transforms the ideals you make that are shown in your human nature.
I think that's very true, since imagination is your own perception of the bound, or even the boundlessness of what you can create or do with your life. So you are bounded by your imagination. That is what determines what your life will be.
I think that's true, but I don't think that was the point that Nick was referring to in my chapter. Because he was talking about the way in which imagination changes your conception of the world and affects the ideals that you're also creating, so that living for the sake of those ideals, you end up with something very different from what you would have had if you would have a different level of imagination. Now, it's also true what you were just now saying, that there are limits to one's imagination. And one of the functions of art and of science, but above all of teaching, is to awaken imagination in other people so that those bounds will no longer exist.
Or at least be expanded. There are there's always going to be a bound, since the mind is not an infinite.
No, but within the limitations of imagination, we use very little of the totality, and therefore that's the job of art and science and education. There's a phrase that I like very much, so it's just a cliche, that the scales fell from my eyes. It probably comes from the Bible, meaning that until something was pointed out to me, or something I read or experienced affected my powers of perception, there were things I couldn't see, things I couldn't imagine, and when the enlightening event occurred, it's as if there were scales on my eyes and they fell away. Well, I think that is what happens to us very often when we benefit from art, from science, from education. It's within a certain overall parameter of possibilities in the imagination, but since we use so little, there's a great deal of opportunity for developing one's imagination much further. The filmmaker, I think I've mentioned before, Jean Renoir, in his writings on film, says in one place, I quickly learned when I started making movies in 1930s that the modern man had lost his power to see. Not literally, but somehow he didn't observe things, and that the function of film art is to get us just to sense the world better, to see things further, to have new kinds of immediate experiences than we are accustomed to anymore, because there's the whole pressure of technology, of commercialization, and he doesn't go into it, but increased pressures from the overpopulation and all kinds of influences upon individual personalities such that we don't develop our ability to imagine, and consequently we don't see as much, and that's the job of the artist. And I think that's right. But doesn't suggest that there's an infinite improvement that's possible, just an awful lot. And this will vary from person to person, society to society, and I think also art, from one art to another, and art and science, different ways and different areas and different degrees in which imagination can be developed, but all creativity will be a function of that effort being made. I think that's the crucial thing. And it affects our ideals. Nick mentioned ideals as something we live with, but they're never fixed. They're subject to evolution too. On this, John Dewey's writings are very good. That he says we've got to think about ideals the way we do about other natural entities. That just as there is an evolution in behavioral forms of animals and the behavior of animals that scientists will discuss, or even geological evolution, astronomical changes that show evolutionary patterns, so too ideals develop. We shouldn't expect them to be a constant. We shouldn't expect them to be written for all eternity by some supreme being who laid them down as the fixed rules for humanities. And certainly in the history of societies, we find they're always shifting. They're like geological plates that are always in the earth, in our world, and moving around. Well, trapping the evolution of ideals, which some writers, sociologists, anthropologists, historians do, but not enough, at least not with the kind of brilliance that a philosopher like Dewey does, though he doesn't do the historical job, just talks about the nature of the problem, would reveal how much we are always creating and recreating our ideals. Our ideals are in flux. At this point, let me make very briefly a comment about something current, which is the tremendous controversy about same-sex marriage. Members of your generation can't possibly have any idea of what attitudes towards that whole area of sexuality were like 30 years ago. I don't know how much you may have read about it, about the sexual revolution, as it's called, in the 1970s. That's what, yeah, about 35 years ago. But all of this is the result of an evolution in Western man, and specifically American society, Western man thinking about his sexuality, its sexuality. This is an evolving, fluid situation. When I was young, nobody even used the word homosexual or knew what it was like. No, it wasn't a matter of any awareness, and there weren't any ideals whether this is good or bad. It was just too bizarre to even to think about, too freakish. In the 70s, a lot of these questions were reopened, and there's been an evolution about what the nature of women, because feminism also started burgeoning at that point, the most recent phase of feminism, and also how sexual orientation ought to be or not to be, and even very recently, when for the first time in certainly American life and maybe the life of most countries, it was legislated that sexual choice was a matter of freedom that the government had no right to interfere in. Just sexual choice. See, that's an evolution, that is an ideal itself, which didn't exist until very recently. And now the further question is, well, assuming that governments can't interfere with sexual choice, or even sexual orientation, how does that implicate upon legalized marriage? That marriage is a great ideal in the Western world, one that has been cherished, not just by the churches, but also by ordinary people in everyday secular life. These ideals are in great flux. And what's going on, what's so exciting, is the fact that what's going on throughout the country is a battle of a sort that always exists between advocates of different ideals and different developments of even the same ideal. And the outcome is always uncertain, but it's never written, in advance in a way that can't be changed. It's a function of evolution. That's relevant to what Nick is talking about because, as you know, by idealization I mean the making of ideals. Well, the making of ideals is an empirical process that people, philosophers, don't think about very much, and that is subject to all of the variability that scientists take for granted when they study geology or biology or one or another form of technology. There's always going to be an evolution. We don't know where it'll go. We can't be sure where it should go. And whatever happens, there's always going to be a great deal of what the anthropologists, the primatologists in particular, call equivocation. You all familiar with that concept?
No.
No, I'm sorry, not equivocation. Forgive me. Equilibration. Equilibration. I'm sorry. Sevi, you're nodding. Do you want to tell people?
You have an idea.
Well, let's say you have two animal colonies and they're hostile toward each other, but they are forced to live in the same place. And so they're always testing their strength against each other. They're always equilibrating. They always try to work out some kind of stable relationship. And if one can't dominate the other, then they have to sort of balance the forces in a way that will be beneficial to both. That's equilibration, and it's part of the natural process in behavioral biology. Well, the same is true of ideals. They are always a function of some equilibration in people living in some particular setting. Is it getting close to the time when we have to stop? You have 5 more minutes, Nick. Go ahead.
Okay. Well,
I mean, you don't need to stop class on account of me. I'll just leave.
Another philosopher predicts that, or Proust predicts that all positive feelings such as sexuality, love, friendship, and just any positive feelings towards other people is really a response to an image created to possess an object. And he sees imagination as relevant to all senses. So this image is an expression of values that is important to the person. It's a projection of ideals that arise due to trying to get maximum fulfillment. So, but the person tries to, or creates this image so he can try and hide the true reality and attain this maximum fulfillment so that he can be more happy. But he's not just also trying to, reach maximum fulfillment. He's also trying to possess the physical, the hidden reality behind the object. The image hides us from what we're truly seeking. I guess the truth of reality, and because of this, we're divided between the search of truth and the human needs to reproduce. So the consummatory oneness will always fail. So, the more you try and attain either one of the needs, the more damaging the failure. Since you'll always fail in trying to attain both truth and human needs, the more you yearn for both of them, the harder the more damaging the failure.
Anybody want to comment on that?
Can you break that down a little bit more?
Yeah, sure. I guess as earlier, like Professor Singer said that we're vegetative beings, but we're also more than vegetative beings as well. And we also, in addition to just trying to reproduce, we'll also try and search for truth. And but since we can't do both, and if we try to do both, we're always going to fail to find this oneness of finding truth and attaining human needs. Okay, and Proust says the only solution to it is to remove himself from all types of affective attachments, all except for the attachment to art, because he sees art as vital for continuing, I guess, the expansion of one's imagination. I wasn't really sure about why he only accepted art from all attachments.
Yeah, that's Proust.
Yeah.
If you want a more elaborate treatment of this question of Proust's philosophy, there is a book of mine called The Nature of Love, the Modern World, and I have in it a 70-page chapter on Proust as a philosopher. These are some later ideas I had, but they're very partial. And the complete presentation of whatever I think about Proust would be found there. Can one assume that everyone knows much about Proust here? None of you have read him. Well, perhaps we can come into him later, but obviously this is not the time. We have just about no time left, so why don't we stop on this? Catch up on the reading, please, for next week. And Tyler will give the presentation on consummation. And the rest of you, I can't be sure when the videotapes will be available. I gave them to be copied at the film office. I would think by the end of this week, beginning of next week, they may very well be. So could you get them just as soon as you can, and
All right.
you'll be told when to come back if they're not yet ready. So I'll see you next week, right?